When someone keeps poking at your emotions, especially someone you once cared for or maybe still do, it's easy to assume it means something about you. You start to question your reactions, your worth, even your sanity. But the first step in taking back your power is recognizing that these emotional jabs aren't about you. They're about control, they're about insecurity, they're about an unresolved need in the other person to provoke a response that validates. And once you realize that, once you see the pattern for what it really is, you stop playing the role that's been scripted for you. You see, people who repeatedly test your emotional stability aren't seeking connection. They're not trying to deepen the relationship or resolve anything. What they're doing is engaging in an emotional tug of war to affirm their dominance, their superiority, or their relevance in your life. And if you take that bait, if you interpret every provocation as a reflection of your inadequacy or failure, you lose twice. First, you lose your peace of mind. Then you lose your grip on truth. Because the truth is, your worth is not up for debate, especially not by someone who uses conflict as currency. Often, when a woman keeps poking at your emotions, it's not because she's genuinely curious about how you feel or where things went wrong. It's because you've become too calm, too quiet, too unfazed for her to feel in control anymore. Emotional volatility, yours, not hers, is what fuels the game. If she can get under your skin, she knows she still matters. And that's a dangerous place to keep your validation. You must learn to interpret these pokes as signals, not signs of love, not attempts at reconciliation, but signals of a person trying to stay relevant by provoking you into an emotional slip. It's a desperate act cloaked in sarcasm, guilt-tripping, passive aggression, or selective silence. And it's subtle. It's not always overt yelling or clear manipulation. Sometimes it's backhanded compliments. Sometimes it's a sudden cold shoulder after things felt peaceful. Sometimes it's a simple text at midnight asking a vague question that she knows will keep you up overthinking. This is where discernment becomes your armor. You have to separate emotion from reality. Just because someone makes you feel small doesn't mean you are. Just because someone criticizes you doesn't mean they're right. And just because you feel destabilized doesn't mean you're weak. Emotions aren't truth. They're signals. And often they're manipulated by people who know how to push your buttons. There is a twisted form of validation some people get from being able to stir others emotionally. It gives them a sense of control, of importance. If they can make you feel guilty, they feel morally superior. If they can make you jealous, they feel desirable. If they can make you angry, they feel powerful. And if you aren't aware of this, you'll think your reactions are necessary, that you're supposed to defend yourself, explain yourself, justify your feelings, but you're not in these situations. Because every reaction is reinforcement, every argument, every emotionally charged text, every late night call you answer feeds the dynamic. It tells her, I'm still hooked. You still have power over me. But when you finally recognize this for what it is, something changes in you. You stop scrambling for the right words. You stop trying to fix things that were designed to be broken. You stop interpreting her emotional pokes as evidence that you still matter to her in a meaningful way. Because you realize it's not about love. It's not about closure. It's about control. It's about ego. And you don't have to play that game. And here's the thing most people don't want to hear. Sometimes the highest form of emotional maturity is silence. It's choosing not to respond. It's choosing not to explain yourself to someone who's not really listening. It's choosing not to defend a truth that doesn't need defending. When someone continually tests you, their goal is to find your weakness. Your silence becomes your strength. Your calmness becomes your weapon. Your refusal to be emotionally hijacked becomes the signal that you're no longer accessible in the way you used to be. That kind of shift is unsettling to someone who used to thrive on your chaos. Mm-hmm. When you stop reacting, when you stop chasing validation, when you start responding from a place of quiet strength, they feel it, and they don't like it. Because it means the old methods don't work anymore. It means you've outgrown the emotional playground. And once you leave that playground, you don't go back. Not to prove a point, not to gain closure, not to show them how much you've changed. You just keep walking, because your piece isn't up for auction anymore. She doesn't get to define your worth with her words or her silence. That's your job now. And the moment you understand that, she starts losing the power she never should have had. When you begin to set boundaries with someone who's used to having access to your emotions without limitation, the reaction is rarely gratitude. It's often hostility, confusion, or manipulation. And that's because your boundaries are a direct challenge to the power they believed they had over you. You're shifting the rules of engagement, and in doing so, you're forcing them to confront something they were never prepared to deal with: your growth, your refusal to play the same emotional games. Now, boundaries aren't just about saying no. They're about declaring, sometimes silently, that you're no longer willing to be controlled by guilt, fear, or the need for approval. When a woman continuously pokes at your emotions, it's not always because she wants to hurt you. Sometimes it's because she doesn't know how to relate to you without that dynamic. She's used to the version of you that tolerated the chaos, that responded every time she stirred the pot, that got pulled into arguments or breakdowns because it made her feel something. Maybe closeness, maybe superiority, maybe just relevance. So when you stop participating, when you say, that's not okay anymore, it doesn't just confuse her, it threatens her sense of control. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always see your strength as an offense. They'll say you've changed. They'll accuse you of being cold, selfish, distant, not because you actually are those things, but because your boundaries no longer allow them the free rein they once had over your emotional space. And what's deeply ironic is that they often know exactly what they're doing. They may act confused, but they're not confused. They just don't like that you've decided to protect yourself, because to them, your pain, your doubt, your reactivity, it served a purpose. It kept you tied to them. It kept them relevant in your internal world. When someone pushes back against your boundaries, especially when they do it subtly, like with guilt tripping or emotional withdrawal, it can make you second guess yourself. You start wondering, am I being too harsh? Should I just give in a little to keep the peace? But that's exactly where the trap is. Because the moment you make your boundaries negotiable, they're no longer boundaries. They're just preferences. And preferences can be ignored. But boundaries backed by self-respect, that's where transformation happens. That's where you stop being a participant in a toxic cycle and start being the one who defines the terms of your emotional life. And here's something else that's important. When you begin to enforce boundaries, you're not only protecting yourself from external chaos, you're creating internal clarity. You begin to see what your values actually are. You start recognizing how many of your previous interactions were rooted in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough. Boundaries flush that out. They shine a light on where you've been operating from insecurity instead of identity. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but that discomfort is growth. That discomfort is you leaving behind the version of yourself that needed to be needed, even at the cost of your own peace. Often, the person who keeps poking at your emotions isn't trying to connect with you on a deeper level. They're trying to access the old you, the reactive you, the people-pleasing you, the one who would bend over backward just to keep the relationship afloat. When that version of you no longer shows up, they panic. Because it means they can't reach you in the same way. It means their usual tools, sarcasm, guilt, subtle jabs, no longer elicit the response they're looking for. And if there's one thing that terrifies someone who thrives on emotional power, it's irrelevance. That's the cost of your boundaries for them, but the reward for you is freedom. And you have to be willing to endure their discomfort, their frustration, their silence, because what you're doing isn't about punishing them. It's about preserving yourself. You're saying, I won't abandon myself just to keep someone else comfortable. And that statement, lived out through your actions, sends a signal that you are no longer emotionally available to be manipulated or minimized. It takes courage to hold the line. It takes strength to resist the urge to explain yourself to someone who's only asking questions to twist your answers. But if you can stay firm, if you can remember why you set those boundaries in the first place, you'll begin to see something powerful. The chaos starts to quiet. The emotional fog begins to lift. And what remains is clarity. Clarity about who you are, what you deserve, and what you will no longer tolerate. You can't control how she reacts. You can only control what you allow. And when you stop allowing the things that once broke you, you start building the life that finally reflects your worth. One of the most critical things to understand when someone is deliberately poking at your emotions is that your silence is not weakness, it's power, it's strategy. It's a refusal to play a game you never agreed to in the first place. The kind of silence I'm talking about isn't passive, it isn't avoidance. It's the silence of someone who has made a choice to rise above manipulation rather than sink into it. Because sometimes the only way to win the game is to stop playing entirely. There's a trap in emotional provocation that most people don't see until they're knee-deep in it. It's this subtle dance where someone triggers you just enough to get a reaction, and then they use that reaction to frame you as the unstable one. They poke, prod, insult, twist the truth, or guilt trip you, not because they want a real conversation, but because they want control over your emotional state. And if you respond, if you yell, explain, plead, or defend, you're feeding the very dynamic they rely on to keep themselves in power. But when you choose to go silent, not in a dismissive or cowardly way, but from a place of grounded self-control, something very powerful happens. You shift the entire dynamic. You take away their script. You deny them the fuel they need to keep the emotional game alive. Because what they want more than anything is your engagement, whether it's anger, sadness, confusion. If they can keep you emotionally entangled, they remain relevant in your world. But your silence says, I'm not giving you that anymore. I'm not making you the center of my emotional life. That's not easy, especially when the person provoking you knows all your buttons. They know your history, your insecurities, your triggers. They know exactly how to phrase something to cut you in half. And it's tempting to retaliate, to prove them wrong, to say, that's not what happened, or you're misunderstanding me. But every time you explain yourself to someone who's already decided to distort your truth, you're wasting energy that could be spent building your peace. Silence is often misunderstood in our culture. People associate it with submission, with defeat. But real silence, the kind born of strength and clarity, is defiance in its most disciplined form. It's a declaration that your emotional well-being is no longer up for negotiation, that you are no longer handing out access to your inner world just because someone demands it through pressure or pain. When you remain silent in the face of provocation, you're not avoiding the conflict, you're transcending it. You're stepping out of the emotional mud and choosing clarity over chaos. And here's something even deeper. Silence allows you to observe. When you're not reacting, you're watching. You start to see patterns. You start to realize how predictable their tactics really are. How each time you begin to heal or detach, the poking intensifies. Not because they care, but because they sense their grip loosening. And that's what provokes the panic. That's what stirs the desperate jabs. They see your silence as a sign that they're losing influence, that they no longer get to define how you feel, how you think, or how you live. So yes, silence can be unnerving to the person who once had emotional access to you. It creates a void they don't know how to fill. They may escalate. They may try new tactics. They may even try to convince you that your silence is abusive. That's the irony. They create chaos, provoke a response, and when you withdraw your energy to protect yourself, they spin it to make you the villain. But you must remember, your silence is not about them. It's about your integrity. It's about not giving your power away to people who only show up to misuse it. There's a freedom that comes when you stop being baited, when you no longer feel the need to defend every misunderstanding or correct every mischaracterization. That's not your job. Your job is to remain centered, to respond only when it serves your peace, not when it satisfies their narrative. Your job is to stop bleeding energy into conversations that are designed to confuse you, not connect with you. And the more you lean into that, the more you begin to understand just how much of your life was being spent reacting instead of living. So let them wonder what you're thinking. Let them feel the discomfort of not being able to access your emotions on command. That's not cruelty, that's consequence. You're teaching them, perhaps for the first time, that your inner world is sacred ground, that it's not something they can just walk into and rearrange when they're bored, insecure, or angry. Your silence sets a new tone, one where peace is protected and chaos is no longer entertained. And in that silence, you rediscover your voice. The one that doesn't shout to be heard. The one that doesn't explain itself to be understood. The one that simply knows, this is who I am, and this is where I stand. Let your silence speak volumes. There's a deeply unsettling moment that happens when you finally stop responding to emotional provocation. And it's not always what you expect. You might think that once you detach and protect your peace, the other person will get the message and move on. But instead, something else often takes place. They begin to escalate. The poking becomes sharper, the jabs more personal, and the intensity ramps up. Because here's the truth. When someone is used to controlling your emotional climate, your calm feels like a threat. Your silence, your boundaries, it creates a vacuum they can't tolerate. So they double down. You need to understand why that happens, not just to prepare yourself, but to make sense of what you're seeing. When you withdraw from someone who's been feeding off your reactions, they experience that as a loss of control. And for people who need emotional chaos to feel significant, losing control is intolerable. So they start searching for cracks in your armor. They'll say things they know will haunt you. They'll bring up old wounds. They'll try to weaponize your empathy. It's not because they're seeking resolution. It's because they're trying to break your resolve. This is where your discipline gets tested. Because emotional discipline isn't just about staying calm when things are easy. It's about remaining steady when someone is trying to throw you off balance on purpose. It's about seeing through the manipulation, not just reacting to the surface level insult. You have to train yourself to step back and ask, what's the goal here? What are they really trying to do? Most of the time, it's not about the words they're saying. It's about whether those words will get a rise out of you. Will you respond? Will you get angry? Will you chase them down to explain yourself? Because the moment you do, they win. Not because they're right, but because they got to dictate your emotional state again. This dynamic plays out so often in relationships where one person is trying to heal and the other person isn't ready to let them. Healing threatens the person who wants you to stay stuck. When you start growing, setting boundaries, walking away from chaos, they panic. They poke harder. It's their way of saying, don't leave the role I've assigned to you. Don't outgrow the version of yourself that served my needs. But they don't say it directly, of course. It shows up in guilt trips. It shows up in sarcasm, in passive-aggressive remarks, in sudden flares of rage or sudden false warmth meant to draw you back in. It's all part of the same strategy, disruption. Because if you're disrupted, you're not healing. You're distracted. So when the escalation comes, and it often will, you need to remind yourself of what's at stake. You're not just trying to win an argument. You're not trying to prove you're the better person. You're reclaiming ownership of your life. You're saying, my emotions are mine, my energy is mine, my peace is not for sale. And that's something worth protecting, even when it costs you the illusion of harmony, because that's what it is, an illusion. The kind of peace that requires you to stay small, stay reactive, stay controlled. That's not peace, that's imprisonment. There's also this trap that says if you just explain yourself better, they'll understand. If you just find the right words, they'll stop. But the truth is, they already understand. They understand that you're pulling away. That's what they're reacting to. And no explanation will make them feel okay with it because it's not about understanding. It's about leverage. So, don't fall into the trap of over-explaining your boundaries. You don't owe anyone a dissertation on your emotional needs. You're allowed to walk away without a dramatic defense. You're allowed to protect your peace without a permission slip. What you're doing by refusing to engage in the escalation is asserting a new emotional standard, one that says, I will no longer be part of cycles that rob me of my clarity. And that can be lonely, can be painful, because not everyone will celebrate your growth. In fact, the people most invested in the dysfunctional dynamic will be the first to criticize you for stepping out of it. That's why it's so important to stay connected to your why. Why did you start healing? Why did you set that boundary? Why did you choose silence over chaos? Hold on to that, because when the poking intensifies, it's easy to forget that you're doing something courageous, that you're breaking a pattern, not running from a fight. And over time, something shifts. They start to realize they no longer have the access they once did. Their tactics fall flat, their words echo without impact, and you start to feel stronger. Not because they changed, but because you did. You stopped needing their validation, you stopped needing their understanding, you stopped needing their peace to have your own. So when they escalate, don't internalize it. Don't mistake their chaos for your failure. It's confirmation that you're no longer playing by rules that were never fair to begin with. Let them escalate. You've already elevated. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone keeps poking at your emotions is to allow their behavior to speak for itself. Not everything requires a reaction. Not every jab deserves an answer. There's a profound strength in restraint, and it's often misunderstood, especially in a world that rewards quick comebacks and emotional fireworks. But when you start holding back, not out of fear or suppression, but from clarity and conviction, you start to become something very difficult to manipulate. You become grounded. You become steady. You become unreadable to those who once relied on your predictability. This is incredibly important, especially when dealing with someone who thrives on emotional power. If you've ever dealt with someone who tests your limits, who pushes you to the edge just to see if you'll fall, then you know the dynamic. They don't just want your attention. They want your instability. They want to shake you, to make you react, to confirm that they still hold influence over your internal world. And if every time they say something hurtful or calculated, you respond emotionally, you're giving them exactly what they want, proof that they can still reach inside and pull your strings. But when you choose not to play that game, when you step outside the emotional ping pong match and stop swinging back, you do something extraordinary. You create a gap. You introduce silence where there was once noise. And in that silence, their words lose traction. They fall flat. They bounce off instead of sinking in. You begin to dismantle the emotional contract that once tied your peace to their behavior. That's the turning point when their provocation becomes background noise instead of a call to arms. There's a misconception, though, that this kind of self-restraint means you're weak or passive. That's not true. It takes an immense amount of internal strength to stay calm when every part of you is screaming to retaliate. It takes discipline to not stoop to the same level, especially when you know exactly how to hurt back. But real power isn't about hurting. It's about knowing you could and choosing not to. That's where you gain control, not just over the situation, but over yourself. Think about what's really happening in those moments. You're being tested. You're being invited to revert to an older version of yourself, the one who couldn't walk away, who needed to be understood, who had to have the last word. But that version doesn't exist anymore. Or if it does, it's being replaced. Every time you choose composure over chaos, you're casting a vote for the person you're becoming. That vote matters because you're training your nervous system to not get hijacked by every emotional poke that comes your way. Eventually, people who keep poking will come to terms with your boundaries. They might not like it, they might resent it, but they'll realize they're not going to get the old version of you back, and that's when the dynamic starts to shift. You're no longer someone they can manipulate with a few well-placed words. You're no longer someone they can guilt, provoke, or shame into breaking your own peace. And make no mistake, there will be discomfort in the beginning. The silence will feel heavy. The lack of response will feel unnatural. You might second guess yourself thinking, should I have said something? Should I have defended myself? But over time, you'll see that your silence is not weakness, it's your highest form of strength. It's your refusal to validate toxicity with your energy. Some people only understand boundaries when they experience the consequence of crossing them. That consequence isn't rage, it isn't revenge, it's absence, it's stillness. It's removing your emotional investment from the game altogether. That's what unsettles them. Not your yelling, not your confrontation, but your disinterest. When they realize they're no longer in control of how you feel, their power begins to evaporate. And that's what this is really about. Not avoiding conflict, but choosing the battleground. You don't need to fight every provocation to prove you're strong. You don't need to explain your detachment to someone who's never respected your emotions to begin with. You simply need to remember what your peace is worth, and more often than not, it's worth far more than the satisfaction of responding. There's a rare kind of respect that emerges when you stop feeding into dysfunction. Maybe not from the person poking, but from yourself. You start to respect your own time, your own energy, your own progress. And that self-respect becomes armor. You walk differently. You think more clearly. You stop doubting yourself for not engaging in things that once felt impossible to walk away from. Eventually, the silence will say everything that needs to be said. It will carry the weight of your growth, your boundaries, your evolution. You won't have to prove anything to anyone. Your emotional stillness will speak for itself. Let them wonder. Let them reach. Let them poke. You've outgrown the need to flinch. One of the most overlooked truths in dealing with someone who constantly pokes at your emotions is that your attention, your emotional attention, is a form of currency. It has value. It carries weight. And the person who keeps pushing your buttons knows this. They're not always consciously thinking, if I upset you, I win. But on some level, they know your reaction confirms that you still care, that you're still connected, that they still hold space in your psyche. This is where the trap lies. Because when your emotions are consistently being pulled into their orbit, you're not operating from clarity. You're reacting. You're tied up in an invisible game you never agreed to play. What you have to understand is that emotional poking isn't always about open hostility or overt aggression. Sometimes it's subtle. It's a passive-aggressive comment. It's selective silence. It's delayed responses or strangely timed social media activity. It's any behavior designed to stir something in you: jealousy, confusion, doubt, anger. And it doesn't always look cruel on the surface. In fact, it might even be wrapped in politeness, concern, or what appears to be affection. But underneath, there's often a motive to get a reaction, to pull you off balance, to test whether they can still touch your emotions in ways you haven't given them permission to. And this is where the need for emotional detachment becomes essential. Not numbness, not coldness, but a deliberate, grounded separation between your inner state and their external chaos. Because when you allow someone to repeatedly dictate how you feel, even if it's subtle, you've handed over your power. You're living in response to them, their moods, their provocations, their timing. That becomes the rhythm of your own emotional world. And eventually, you start losing touch with what you actually want, how you actually feel, because your focus is constantly on trying to manage, decode, or anticipate them. You need to remember that someone who truly respects your emotions won't feel the need to test them. They won't use your heart as a battleground. They won't prod your weaknesses just to watch you squirm. So when someone consistently behaves in a way that stirs confusion, doubt, or emotional instability, especially after you've made your boundaries clear, that's not a misunderstanding. That's not emotional immaturity. That's often intentional. And even if it's not consciously strategic, it's still destructive. And it's not your job to fix that. It's your job to protect your peace. You have to start seeing your peace as sacred, not just something you occasionally fight for, but something you live by. You don't protect it only when it's convenient. You protect it when it's uncomfortable. You protect it when someone you once loved keeps crossing the line with just enough subtlety that you question whether you're overreacting. You're not overreacting. Your body, your mind, your emotional core, they know when someone's disrupting your stability. Listen to that signal. Trust it. Because the truth is, when you don't respond the way you used to, when you stop engaging, stop chasing, stop explaining yourself, there's a moment of power shift. And often they'll escalate as part of the test. They want to see if your silence is real. They want to know if your boundary is permanent or just a temporary defense mechanism. And this is where many people slip. They mistake the other person's sudden intensity for emotional depth or sincerity. But more often than not, it's just a desperate attempt to pull you back into the old emotional dynamic, to reassert control. You don't owe access to anyone who only values your emotions when they're in charge of them. You don't owe your vulnerability to someone who weaponizes it. You certainly don't owe your energy to someone who consistently destabilizes your peace for their own sense of power or validation. What you owe is to yourself, to remain grounded, self-aware, and unwavering in the face of emotional manipulation. And let's be clear, choosing detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about your well-being more than you care about being understood by someone who has no intention of understanding you in the first place. That's a powerful shift. That's the moment when the dynamic starts to unravel for them. When they realize they can't trigger you, they lose interest. Not because you weren't valuable, but because they can't control what they once did, and it leaves them scrambling. It leaves them confused, because the power they once had was never about love. It was about access. It was about influence. And now that it's gone, they don't know what to do with the silence. You don't need to explain your piece to anyone. You don't need to argue for your boundaries. Your stillness, your refusal to play the game, your detachment, that is the answer. That is the final word. So the next time they poke at your emotions, hoping to stir a storm, let them be met with silence, calm, and the undeniable strength of someone who has outgrown their chaos. When you find yourself facing someone who persistently pokes at your emotions, testing your limits, it's crucial to understand that true strength doesn't lie in reacting, it lies in restraint. There's a deep wisdom in recognizing that not every provocation deserves a response. The challenge, of course, is that human nature is wired to respond, to defend, to justify, to push back. But what if the real power was in breaking that cycle? What if, instead of feeding into the emotional poking, you chose instead to hold steady, grounded in your own truth? This requires a level of self-mastery that many aspire to, but few achieve. It means cultivating an inner space so secure, so solid, that external jabs no longer penetrate your equilibrium. It's like standing firm in the eye of a storm. The winds howl, the rain lashes, but the center remains calm, unmoved. When you develop that kind of emotional resilience, you shift the entire dynamic. You no longer give the provocateur the reaction they seek. Instead, you become a mirror reflecting calmness where there once was chaos. There's an important principle here about control. We often think control is about manipulating others or our circumstances. But real control is about mastering yourself, your thoughts, your feelings, your impulses. When someone tries to poke at your emotions, they're testing the boundaries of your control. They want to see if they can disrupt your peace, if they can stir a reaction that pulls you off balance, but by maintaining restraint, you send a clear message. You are not a puppet to be pulled and pushed at will. You are the sovereign of your own emotional realm. This doesn't mean you suppress your emotions or pretend everything is fine when it's not. Far from it. Emotional maturity involves acknowledging your feelings fully, but choosing how and when to express them. It means being aware of your triggers, but refusing to be controlled by them. When someone pokes at your vulnerabilities, the wise response is to pause, to breathe, and to respond, not react. There's a world of difference between these two. Pause and breath create space. Space creates clarity, and clarity brings power. When you react immediately to a provocation, you hand over your power on a silver platter. You become entangled in their game. But when you pause, you regain control. You consider your response with intention rather than impulse. That is the essence of emotional discipline. Another dimension to consider is that people who continually poke at your emotions are often doing so because of their own insecurity or need for control. Their behavior is less about you and more about their internal chaos. Recognizing this helps you detach from taking their actions personally. It frees you from the emotional tug-of-war and allows you to maintain your dignity. You don't have to fix them, change them, or even understand them fully. Your responsibility is to yourself and your own emotional health. This leads to an important insight. Boundaries are essential. Without clear boundaries, emotional poking turns into emotional invasion. You must define what is acceptable and what isn't in how others treat you, and when those boundaries are crossed, the response of restraint and calm becomes your strongest defense. It's not about punishment or revenge. It's about preservation, preserving your mental and emotional well-being so that you can thrive beyond the noise. Moreover, practicing restraint in the face of emotional poking teaches others how to treat you. If you respond with volatility, you reinforce the pattern. If you respond with calm, you disrupt it. This is a subtle but powerful form of communication. It tells others that your emotions are not playgrounds for their amusement or arenas for their conflict. It sets a tone of respect and self-worth. It's also important to remember that restraint builds inner confidence. When you know you can withstand emotional provocation without losing your composure, you step into a higher level of self-respect. You become less reactive, less dependent on external validation, and more anchored in your own sense of identity. This is transformative because it means your emotional state becomes self-sustained rather than other-dependent. In life, people will always test limits, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unconsciously. The difference is how you respond. Do you fall into the trap of emotional reactivity, or do you rise to the challenge of self-mastery? The choice is yours. But those who master restraint create a life where emotional poking no longer dictates their peace or their worth. So when the next poke comes, resist the urge to retaliate or justify. Instead, hold your ground with calm, with clarity, and with the quiet power of someone who has learned that the greatest victory is not in the fight, but in the refusal to be drawn into it. This is where true strength lives.